Welcome back. It's another fantastic episode of the Cronulla Jazz and Blues Festival podcast. Kicking off May 28th, we're all going to be down in the Shire having a fantastic time celebrating this mistress we know as music. And one of the amazing acts we have lined up this year, please God don't let it rain again, one of the amazing acts we have for our sunny weekend coming up is one of two icons, not just of Australian music, but also Australian entertainment. I'll ask him a couple of questions about that as we get in. But James Valentine, welcome to the show. How are you?
Now, I think I'm inside. I think the rain will be fine. Rydges Hotel. Yeah, so that possibly. I'm assuming that's indoors.
It is indoors, but it wasn't very nice walking in when you got people like, absolutely saturated and perspiration and intoxication and dedication.
If that's the crowd that's turning up, forget it. I'm not there.
It's the blues crowd, mate. It's not just the jazz crowd. So
the blues crowd.
We'll blame them. There's a few country people too. So. I want to go back. I always love going back to the beginning. Where did James Valentine and music first meet?
Excuse me. Well, I was really introduced to music like at primary school when they handed out the recorders, and I just started playing. Look, within a few weeks I was playing it, like every other kid's going, and I'm going, like I'm sort of getting the tunes and I'm following the book. And so the good thing was that my parents and teachers kind of went, oh, okay, well, you seem to be across this. Because I could play the recorder, they kind of went, what about a flute? So I ended up with a flute teacher. Now, this is in country Victoria, in Ballarat in Victoria, early 70s, and with parents and even teachers, really, who didn't know much about music at all. My parents have no music in them whatsoever, zero. If there's a gene for repelling music, they've got that, So like I do remain eternally grateful to them for sort of going, okay, well, let's see how this goes, and what about the flute? So it's sort of a bit odd, but I really liked it. I liked practicing. Once I got to high school, I did all the classical exams and that sort of thing, and then started to hear jazz. Luckily, there was a teacher who was also who went, he was a saxophone player and flute player, and he played jazz, and so I got good introduction at that sort of point during my teens.
And that makes you a bit of an anomaly because we're starting a podcast later on this year. It's called My Father's Record Collection, because so many musicians we talk to every day my dad had this amazing record collection. I still remember listening to Hot August Night the first time, or Roy Orbison's Memphis and so on. I remember what the carpet felt like on my knees. But so many of our colleagues and our peers have had that musical upbringing, which you're saying, hey, music was not an option. Was there any other creativity or creative arts in the house besides music?
I'm just laughing. My father's record collection was Herb Albert and the Tijuana Brass. Two albums.
Not a bad album. Not a bad album. That's the one with the really great, fantastic album cover with the voluptuous lady with the whipped cream.
I think it was largely bought for the cover.
Excellent.
I would suggest. Yeah, I mean, oddly enough, my mother is an interesting one here. My mother's a broadcaster. My mother's still alive. She's 98 and still lives in Ballarat. She was a radio broadcaster from 1945, so very unusual for a young woman. She's only 18 or 19. She got a job at the local station. She was, staff announcer. She's reading out the ads, reading out whatever they did on radio in that sort of day. She did that for 4 or 5 years. She was then sort of like largely local media. She would write articles for the local paper, and she was a stringer for the ABC. She'd do interviews for Australia All Over and those sort of programs. This is through my childhood.
Macca was still on air back then.
Well, this is pre-Macca. Macca was like assistant producer. Macca was like 18. Really? Like this is like my mother's 30 years older than Macca, if that's possible, and then still be alive.
Macca's like the Keith Richards of Australian radio, for those who don't know.
Macca is the Keith Richards of Australian radio. So Macca was like sort of office boy when my mother's sending in tapes, and that kind of thing. So I did grow up around media in a kind of local, quite parochial sort of fashion. But at least, as a kid, I went to radio studios. I went to the local radio studio after school. Mum would either pick me up, or I think I walked out after school. This is primary school. It was only 3 blocks down the road kind of thing. So I walked down there and would wait there for Mum to finish doing something. So, I was around that kind of thing. But they were also very formal and kind of, proper old-fashioned Australians who, for the notion of, I'm like, really the only reason I got to be a musician is I'm the youngest. My two older brothers were like, no, there'll be nothing like that. But by the time they got to me, it's like, oh, whatever, off you go.
Your brothers got to get a real job.
That's right. They had to get a real job. With me, they'd given up by the time they got to me.
Did you study music or jazz composition or anything like that later in life?
Yeah. I went
Post-education?
to, like, after school, I went to, after HSC, it was about 1979, 1980. I chose between, I got into the Sydney Jazz course at that point at the con, but I chose to go to a place in Melbourne, which is called Melbourne State College, which is basically part of Melbourne University. That had the only classical saxophone teacher, a guy called Dr. Peter Clinch. And I just thought, I'll go and do that. It's a bit closer to home. Felt a bit much moving to Sydney at that point. But I also just thought, I want to learn sort of like actual saxophone technique. Hated it. Did about a year. I didn't drop out, but then I just started getting lessons from other people in Melbourne. I shared a house with a guy called Tony Hicks, who's a monster saxophone player, so I was learning a lot from him. I just started working. I was committed to sort of wanting to be a working player, so I got gigs. My first gig was in this horrible band that played, called Sean and the Fiddler, and played sort of Eagles covers, a couple of originals, and Irish jigs and reels. And it was based.
There's a market for that right now. Bring that band back right now.
Total market for that. Well, the market then, you say this to the young people, they don't believe you. We had 3 gigs a day, 5 and 6 days a week. Lunchtime gigs, 5 o'clock gigs, nighttime gigs. Yeah. And we had something like 15 residencies. Tuesday was the Argyle Inn or whatever it was at lunchtime. It'd be 12 till 2. Pack up, chuck it in. There was a combi, chuck it in the combi, drive over to somewhere where we were playing 5 till 7 or something like that. So, kind of good experience. After that, I went into a thing that was called the Anne and Johnny Hawker Big Band, and so that worked 5 or 6 nights a week at a theatre restaurant, and that was playing the Glenn Miller, Count Basie sort of book, but sort of professional setting. And John Hawker was an extraordinary arranger. John Hawker could write arrangements in the band room, smoking and talking. Like he'd have manuscript open and go, okay, so look, and he'd be chatting about something else, but he's writing out the tenor saxophone part. It's very impressive.
That's what they call a multi-instrumentalist.
A multi-instrumentalist. He could smoke Craven A's, play the trombone, and do an arrangement, triple threat. But from that, I sort of went, I think this is a bit. I'm definitely with the elderly here, and so I sort of lucked into Aussie rock bands. I started with Joe Camilleri and toured with him for a year, and that sort of got me into that scene.
I want to talk about that scene in a moment, but you mentioned then like the 2 or 3 gigs a day and the residency. So you've seen the Australian music industry over many years, both from a broadcaster point of view and from a musician. What's changed? Because the good old days were fantastic. We're still going out and seeing live music, but is it the venues? Is it poker machines? Is it Netflix? What's changed?
It's all of that. I'm sort of, I suppose, philosophical but have also thought about this a lot. Fashion changes. And largely I put it down to fashion. The fashion at that point and the culture at that point was to go and see live music, but also music had to be live. There wasn't the element of having recorded music. If even a restaurant had to have recorded music, they probably had to have reel to reel. They had to have something that would run for 2 or 3 hours. You couldn't have somebody going and changing records or cassettes and so to have quality sound, it was often just easier to have a pianist and a guitarist in the corner. It was, so everything tended to have these lunchtime gigs. It's just, businessmen getting on the booze and we're just sort of playing in the corner, really. So there was that culture, the culture of people wanting to go and see bands. Like then when I'm in Australian rock bands, we could play a Wednesday night at, the San Miguel or something, and it'd be us, the Hoodoo Gurus, and Spy versus Spy or something. There'd be 500 people there. You play a Wednesday night in Coffs Harbour, and 500 people had turned up. That's a different culture. I think when people start to look at, say, is it poker machines or something like that, I think you've got to say the culture of entertainment was different. What people were seeking was different, and that was the prime entertainment. I basically saw the end of that. I saw the end of the pub rock dominance, the end of that sort of stuff, where we would tour for a year at a time, play 6 nights a week, and that kind of thing. And by the end of the 80s, you'd tour for 2 months. You'd tour for 6 weeks. You'd have a tour that might go for 2 months, but it was only 4 nights a week. The culture had shifted. There's lots of people I often point out the kind of money that a young person, let's say 20 to 30-year-old, might have spent on live music in those days. Now spend on food.
Mm.
Like that culture. There was no food. There
Yeah.
was nothing to eat in the 70s and 80s. You didn't spend $100 at a restaurant. You didn't spend $25 on a cocktail. Whereas a 25-year-old, with a job and going out on a Friday night is more likely to go and spend, $100, $200 on food
Mm.
and on drink than they are on a show.
Yeah. And it's quite so like $25 a cocktail. You're there with your partner. That's $50 a round. 3 or 4 rounds is $200.
That's right.
Meals another $150, and Uber
That's
each
right.
way's $50. So young people
Yeah.
can all of a sudden drop $300 or $400 or $500 in a night, especially when they're young people or apprentices. That might be their income.
That might be the income, and that's whereas that wasn't an option. So to spend $25, or it might have been 10 or 15, I can't really remember. I was inside. I wasn't on the door, but like let's say $10 or $15 to get in and see these three bands, and then buy schooners. That's the culture of the time. It's a different culture now.
But still, I was at a bar in Sydney a few months ago, and great 6-piece jazz band, giant double bass, Hammond organ, beautiful drums, everything like that. End of the night, would have been 50, 60 people there. End of the night, they got $250 between them. It's just like, guys, that's so hard. But they don't care. They're there for the love, the passion and so on. That's one thing I don't think has changed since that heyday of 80s pub music and 80s rock, is that the people who still go and embrace live music, because we're going to get to share at the Cronulla Jazz and Blues Festival, they're there for that passion. They're there for that love. They're there for that feeling or that buzz that Netflix can't get them, or a computer game can't get them. And so on,
I think there's a coming appetite too for this, because we're so tied to screens. There is a coming appetite for things that aren't, mediated through a screen, where you are actually in the room, someone's doing something, whether that's talk or it's music or something like that. Yes, I think there is that appetite's back. I think what we have to try and do is think about it in terms of, I do a lovely gig on a Thursday with my son, and this is at the Everleigh Hotel in Redfern. They play 5:30 to 7:30, 8 o'clock, something like that. They're just in the corner. It's just him and his mate in the corner playing. I just go and join in on, take a saxophone and a flute and hang out with them. And it's to me, it's more like an Irish pub, in Ireland. There's just guys playing in the corner. I'd like to see way more of that, way more just sort of casualization, the normalization of music in the corner of the bar and the cafe.
It's funny to say, because I was reading the other day, like they were saying now, there's what they're calling the mum gig, and it starts at 7 and it's done by 10.
Oh,
Instead of the band waiting until 10 or 11 o'clock to come on, the mum gig is getting the groups of mums from the school, and they're going out for a meal, and then they're watching the band at 7 o'clock. So I think the older I get, I think that's fantastic.
I've got a show that's touring James Valentine's Upbeat Review. They're all matinees.
Yeah.
Like we basically, you do 3 o'clock on a Saturday, 4 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, fills up. People love it, because, I'm playing to my age, basically. They don't want to necessarily be out at 8. They're not going to go out 8 o'clock on a Thursday. They might go out 8 o'clock on Saturday, but matinees, love them.
We're going to have you down at the Cronulla Jazz and Blues Festival in a week's time. What can we expect from your performance?
Well, I've got a traditional organ trio. Clayton Dole will be on the organ, superb organist. Nick Cecilia on drums, Sam Rollins on guitar. I mean, these three are masters of this particular form. The Jimmy Smith tune, the Grant Green tune, that kind of sound, where the organ is the central texture of the sound. The Hammond organ is a central texture. The bass is being played on the organ, and you tend to play sort of soul kind of grooves, that sort of feel, rather than a walking bass and traditional ride cymbal. I do. We do some of those traditional Jimmy Smith repertoire, but I also I'm sort of challenging myself to do tunes that are not normally played in this context, because again, that's what those trios did. If you went to a bar in New York in 1960 and there was a Hammond trio, they would have played the Motown hits. They would have played the Beatles songs. Well, perhaps not 1960, but by 64 they would have. But they would have played just the songs on the radio, but in a kind of soul feel and in a jazz feel and with improvisation, that sort of stuff. So we're doing a bit of that. It's perhaps not that modern, but I like to play Fire and Rain. I like to play Just Stand By Me. I play Careless Whisper. Careless Whisper we do as a sort of fast salsa. So you find a different groove, or you find something like that. And it's coming back to a notion of in the heyday of jazz and the heyday of these sort of bands, when the audience walked in and the Miles Davis band is playing Surrey with the fringe on top, they've been to see Oklahoma. They know what that tune is. They know that tune. They've got the soundtrack of Oklahoma at home. And they look up and go, we know this tune. Around with the Surrey. And then they go, isn't it cool what they're doing with it? When a band today plays Surrey with the Fringe on Top or Autumn Leaves, there is no relationship. The audience, unless they're steeped in jazz history, don't have a relationship to the tune. I'm actually really trying to play jazz for people who don't go to jazz gigs in a lot of ways. I'm trying to say, you can come and see me. You know me from the radio. It'll be fun. And I'll play tunes, you'll have a good time. And that is really the audience. And afterwards they go, oh, I didn't think I liked jazz, but that was all right.
I think it's because of the onset of streaming and obviously those horrible words we don't like to say as musicians, but I took in the back in the day, people then would be on and Jimmy Barnes would have a new album and that's you'd hear that single for 6 weeks or 3 months. Yeah. And there'd be a tour. Whereas now Spotify and Amazon, all these other different things, they say, you've listened to Jimmy Smith, here's something else you might like. And allows for that exploration. I think that's where the opportunity comes in for young people. Jimmy Smith, for instance, is one of the most sampled artists in the hip-hop industry.
Yeah, right.
And that's going to happen the last couple of years because the grooves and the sound and so on. It's a fantastic vibe. Yeah. And then what happens is, and people like, my daughter's into vinyl and my niece is, they get it. Cover art encapsulates them. Dude, some of those Jimmy Smith covers were so amazing. All those Verve covers. Now you can't get that on a tiny little screen and so on. You can't get that emotion. And so many artists now using AI to generate that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
It sort of needs to be what's old is new again. But I love the concept. I mean, Clayton, what a fantastic musician he is. And And he was even saying, like, I talked to him last year and something like the importance of something like Jimmy Smith and how important that music is. And, especially the success that he had as an African American in that time in America as well was so, especially in the jazz community.
Yeah.
Well, that's going to be fantastic. I'd want to ask you one question about the days doing with Joe and everyone else that you worked with. Is there one musician that, it's probably an impossible question, is there one musician, one band leader that you felt you learnt the most off as a professional and as a musician?
I learned the most from that Joe Camilleri band. It was a band he had between Joe Depp and the Falcons and the Black Sorrows. So it lasted for about a year or so, maybe 18 months. It was called the Char Band, and he was trying to do a sort of Kid Creole and the Coconuts salsa sort of feel. So it was a 3-piece horn section and a couple of singers, percussionist, that sort of stuff. And so it was a fantastic combination of, there were a couple of guys that had been in the Falcons. Jeff Burston was on guitar. So, there's a veteran. Ray Piera was on percussion, who's a fabulous percussionist, but it was one of his first gigs. Jane Clifton was singing. So, I turned 21 in that band and I'm with these veterans. I'm with Joe Camilleri. So I learned so much stagecraft. I learned so much performance. I learned what it was to be a musician day after day after day. They introduced me to so much music. Like I was a total jazz nerd. I knew a lot about Stan Getz, and they just sort of go, Marvin Gaye. And you go, and Marvin would be, they go, you are an idiot. You are a young, unformed fool. And so there was so much music I got out of that, just being in the hire car and they're pulling out cassettes and, the conversation around it. That's the sort of, I think in those bands, that was sort of the main thing. After that, I tended, like Models was more like a showbiz experience than a music experience in a lot of ways, and a recording experience. Recording from, recording of that style in the 80s from that band and from those players. I also learned sort of overall from those rock guys that to get over the kind of complexity of jazz or privileging the complexity of music, often an E chord, as they say about country music, 3 chords and the truth. You learnt the strength of that sort of statement. Whereas when you come from a jazz background, you're often sort of like, oh, more notes, must be better or something like that. Oh, complex rhythm. Whereas in actual fact, if you can lay down a great groove and you speak with truth through the horn or through your voice, what else does anyone want to hear? So I learnt that a lot of that kind of thing from working with those musicians.
Also, I spent some time with Joe a couple of years ago and very, very late nights, early morning at the basement. And what I got from him was his professionalism, but also as a leader, but also he considered every other member of the band. So many times we see the band member and it's almost like Bon Jovi, for instance, like there's John and the rest of the band are employees. Whereas, and that's right. Why they're a bit of a pickle at the moment. But, and the same thing, like Jimmy Buffett's band was the same thing. They were all employees. They had to have a certain amount of dates. Whereas
Yeah,
Alan Leary
yeah.
in his various interpretations, and I think yourself, a few times when I've seen you, you're in that synergy with the band because you're all equals. You respect
Oh,
each
yeah.
other's
Yeah, yeah.
credentials, and I think that's so important, isn't it?
Yeah, and the Black Sorrows was that. If you think of Joe's Black Sorrows, Vicar and Linda Bull on vocals. It was often, I forgot the bass player's name, a young guy who was around when monster bass player. Nicky Bomber was often in that band and writing for Joe and that kind of thing. So it was that. I think Jeff Burston was in it as well. So it was, he put together bands of people he wanted to form a band with, not just I need a guitarist, I need a drummer, that kind of thing. So he was. And even in the Char Band, I think he did this, and definitely in the Black Sorrows and in the Falcons, he's casting personality
Yes.
as well, like a Duke Ellington. He doesn't want just a trombone player. He wants Steve Ewer playing trombone because he's a certain kind of guy. And
That's a great analogy. Actually, I was thinking about now.
that's the
Duke
same. You
Ellington's
want to
a great
put,
analogy.
yeah, and that's not enough bands do that,
Yeah.
and I think even in jazz, it can be a bit generic a lot of the times. It's like, well, everyone's playing the sort of formal notion of what the bass player should be doing. I want personality, like Darren Heinrich or Clayton, the organists. They've got completely different personalities, but there's personality, there's character there. And it shines through. Nick Sear is a drummer whose spirit bursts forth from the drums. He's not just sort of playing the technically correct or anything like that, even though he's a monster percussionist. There is this sort of whole there's great humor comes out of Nick's playing. Sam Rollins has this beautiful sort of quiet character. Like, we did a show the other day. I mean, in the show I talk a lot. It's stand up as much as music and that sort of stuff. And I was doing something with the audience, and Sam suddenly piped up. He suddenly started talking, and I went, "Oh my God, Sam's joined in!" And it was like the mute speaks. It was beautiful. So
Boris Karloff, it's alive.
It's alive, So if you can get that going, if you can get that sort of thing, then I think that's when people really start to relate to a band more than. The Springsteen's band is that, isn't it? The E Street Band is they're all characters. Stevie Van Zandt is a character. Clarence Clemens was a character. It's I think that means more than when it's just the session guys.
And I think that allows for that connectivity, that conversion, and the bands that are coming, they're following you, or they have that connection, or they bring someone else. I've got one band I see, and they come up from Melbourne about twice a year. They always take 2 or 3 different people. Then they become fans. And I think that's one thing that music has always done. Thank you so much for your time today. We're going to put the details for James' show.
Pleasure.
Link to Cronulla Jazz and Blues Festival. Last quick question I want to ask you, because you're responsible for several of my homework detentions from the 80s and 90s and so on. So thanks for that.
Yeah.
Didn't do any homework because I had to sit down and watch James Valentine tell me what was coming up on Monkey Magic. So thanks for that, James. My parents will be in touch, but
Pleasure. Look, I shaped you, Adam. I often feel as though there is a generation out there that I created.
Very important theological question. Did you have a favourite episode of Monkey Magic? The original one, not the bad ones we get now, but did you have a favourite episode?
I did watch them. I watched most of the shows at some point, just so I knew what I was coming in and out of. I wasn't there live. The links were recorded. So I would watch the shows beforehand. I have no favourite episode of Monkey Magic, but I would say that Monkey Magic is one of my sort of favourite things to kind of think, what the hell was that doing on the ABC at 5 o'clock in the afternoon? How the hell did that get there? And it's one of those peculiar things. I think it's like they bought something else and it came with 100 episodes of Monkey Magic,
Which never finished, mind you, that never finished, never got to India.
Never got there, nothing ever happened. But why this strangely dubbed, kind of scatological and sort of, I don't know, sexually progressive children's show was on the ABC was just hilarious to me and remains hilarious to me. I don't think you could run it today. I think if you put it on today, people would be totally freaked out.
But then the BBC asked John Cleese. No, it was I think it's the second or third episode. I'm very obsessed. That's my problem.
Right.
And the monkey's chasing the monster, and the monster goes in the cage, and he's cave, and the door closes, and monkey bashes on the door. Open up, you poofter! And it's like, how do you get that out there? But there's so much double entendres with Pigsy and Sandy, and
I know.
Even the fact like Tripitaka was a woman, playing a man. So it's thing. But even like I was reading a few weeks ago, the BBC asked John Cleese.
Acceptable. It was perfectly acceptable in those days or it was considered normal for Australians to watch badly dubbed Asian programs. We were all samurai. a generation before as well, jumping out of trees and like we just yelled at one another and this in the playground. So there was something of a tradition by the time we got to Monkey Magic.
I had the stick painted in the stick there. I remember we had my grandfather's place had the TV Week fold out poster was Monkey, so. But I remember they say how things have changed. Like BBC asked John Cleese to go and revise the Germans episode of Fawlty Towers.
Yeah, right.
Yep, no worries. The episode now goes for 4 minutes, and based off your standards, So
yeah, that's right.
Unfortunately, what's old is new again sometimes, but sometimes we just need to look back at those good old days, and we're going to get to share some of your amazing music and maybe some stories and some stand-up when we get together at the Cronulla Jazz and Blues Festival. So we're going to put a link to all James' socials and everything like that so you can see him online. James Valentine, from one fan of popular culture and Australian music to another, thank you so much for my childhood and for the series of detentions and the short sticks I got from Brother Venantius, whatever his name was. And we'll see you and this amazing band you put together in Cronulla in a few weeks' time.
Thanks, Adam. See you again.
See you again.